Hello everybody, welcome to Awesome Rusty Bucket. Subscribe to the channel if you're over on YouTube and drop a like. It helps the video do a lot better in the algorithm, so it's much appreciated. Also check us out over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you want to enjoy this as an audio-only experience. So every year, generally speaking, I try to do something resembling power rankings. There's been times where I've done one video for every NBA team and then didn't really end up completing it, or just one video where I outright just spelled it out and didn't go into too much depth. So this year, we'll see if this format ends up working. I've decided to break this down into essentially a 3-part mini-series where I am discussing what I would say is every class in the NBA. The top tier contenders, the middling teams, the middle class, if you will, and what will be the lower class, some of the worst teams in the NBA. So in this part, we're going to be starting from the bottom, talking about what teams will be the worst ones in the 2024-2025 season. So this isn't going to be a discussion about super fun things. It's more about who's better at sucking. A good old-fashioned suck-off, if you will. Before I get into today's video, I want to talk about our sponsor, Factor. Factor makes your nutrition goals easy by delivering fresh, never-frozen meals right to your door. Being able to prepare something quickly with Factor really helps the people like me who have a hectic schedule. All it takes is 2 minutes in the microwave and my meal is ready. Factor also offers options that make it easy to stick to my goals. You can specify these options to your lifestyle or dietary restrictions. I went with Protein Plus because I've been trying to get those gains, and when things get hectic, Factor is flexible. Change your weekly order up as much as you like with plans from 4 to 18 meals, or pause and reschedule your deliveries anytime. Plus, Factor now offers loads of snack options like breakfast, smoothies, juices, small bites, and more to keep me going no matter what's on the schedule. In the past, I've struggled to stay on top of my meal plan and picked fast options that were not necessarily the healthiest ones and definitely not cheap. But now, because of Factor, when I don't have the time to prepare something, I can both get the convenience and nutrition as well as a great taste. Head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code ALSORUSTY50 to get 50% off of your first box and 20% off of your next month of orders. That's code ALSORUSTY50 at Factor75.com to get 50% off of your first box, plus 20% off of your next month of orders. And thanks again to Factor for sponsoring today's video. So I'm going to be starting from 21 down. I'm pretty much expecting all of these teams to be in the lottery conversation, teams that are going to be trying to bottom out and get a draft pick. Pretty much all of these teams are headlined by young players who have some upside, but are not really ready to contribute to consistent, serious winning basketball as of right now. So first, the best team, I think, of the bad teams, the only team, maybe there's 2/3 here that could theoretically make a playoff spot, mainly because they're in the Eastern Conference. But the Atlanta Hawks are a team that I actually think could be decent this year, and that's primarily because their last 2 years have kind of been stalled due to the addition of DeJounte Murray. They made the Eastern Conference Finals run in 2021 where they would lose to the Milwaukee Bucks in 6 games. They beat the Philadelphia 76ers in a series they were favored to lose in, but they won it in 7 games, infamously because Ben Simmons decided to pass the ball when he had a dunk on Trae Young available. But since then, they had a down year with injuries, and then they hit the panic button and traded for at least a guy who's ostensibly a star player, giving up a lot of draft capital to do that. And unfortunately, DeJounte and Trae just did not click. They did not mesh. They did not make each other better players. It was more like my turn, your turn, and less like I'm making you a better player, which is generally the aim you look for when you're trying to add a complementary star player to your franchise star player. And, well, that didn't end up working out. They traded him to the New Orleans Pelicans, and while the rest of the roster hasn't exactly been great, or not like they had just some amazing offseason, they do have Jalen Johnson on the come up, who just had a great second season. I believe he could crack into the 20-point per game mark. Ironically, I think he can be what John Collins failed to be, which is like this versatile scoring power forward that can shoot the 3 ball, but also is devastating rolling to the basket. I think the more perimeter aspects of John Collins' game were much more forced than they are with Jalen. For Jalen, it seems to come a lot more naturally. So I think he's going to be probably one of the best second options, if not just the best second option that Trae has had to this point in his career. I think Onyeka Okongwu has a chance to get better, potentially even finally leapfrog Clint Capella in the rotation. DeAndre Hunter actually had a pretty good season last year, better than I thought that he did. Given that this is a team that, with a very similar core, did make the Eastern Conference Finals, heavily predicated on their opponent blowing a second-round matchup, but either way, getting rather far, given that it was, I believe, should have been Trae Young's third season in the NBA. If they ended up being a playoff team now with the simple addition by subtraction of not having DeJounte wasting anyone's time, not taking away from Trae's game. If you'll notice Trae's stats from the past couple of seasons, from the past 2 seasons with DeJounte, are considerably worse than what they were earlier in his career. Not even just that the counting stats went down, but the efficiency isn't even all that great. So I'm expecting Trae to have a career year, and the Hawks kind of go as Trae goes, which in many ways has some major faults to it. But if Trae does have a bounce-back season and ends up being a top 15 player in the NBA, wouldn't shock me if the Atlanta Hawks ended up being good. At number 22, I have placed the Charlotte Hornets, and the reason they are this high is if LaMelo Ball actually played a relatively healthy season, even if we called it 50 games played. For this point in his career, that would be extremely healthy from what he's done. He's played more in the 30s more often than not the past couple of years, but when the Hornets play with LaMelo, they are around a 500 team. That's in the past, before they even had Brandon Miller on the roster. Brandon Miller, I think, is probably going to have a second-year leap. He had a really good rookie season, and specifically if you look at his second half of the year, he was playing pretty much like a fucking all-star at that point, like in the mid-20s scoring-wise, on a really excellent efficiency, high volume, high percentage three-point shooting. So if he has a good year, their center Mark Williams, who I think could also have another leap. That's a good core 3 right there. And I don't feel great about the power forward, or I think it's maybe not a power forward, but forward in general, that they just drafted. I also think that it sucks that Miles Bridges is on the team, but he is a good basketball player, unfortunately. As a whole, this does make Charlotte a team that could theoretically be competitive. They also have Trey Mann, who had a lot of good moments for them last year. Grant Williams as well. The Hornets actually went on a little bit of a winning streak to close the year because both of those guys were actually playing way better than they really had any right to. I could see Trey Mann essentially turning into like a 6-man for this team, the good, the typical microwave scoring option off of the bench. I like this team a lot. I think they can actually be pretty good. Health just needs to permit. And if you actually told me that LaMelo played 60, 70 games this season, I would actually predict them to make a playoff spot. But unfortunately, that's probably not a safe prediction to make. Probably the best team that will be missing the playoffs, more likely than not, in the Western Conference this year will be the Houston Rockets. The Rockets are at a weird position where they actually have a lot of young players to be interested in, a lot of them with a lot of upside, but I don't think that the sum of their parts is as good as it should be in an ideal world, and I do think there are some fits that are not outright bad, but definitely a little bit questionable, like Jalen Green being not a strong playmaker and not a super strong pick and roll partner, but also the best player on the Rockets being a center who is an offensively minded center. They don't always have as good of a 2-man game as you would like your lead guard and your lead big man to have. Reed Shepherd is coming in as a player who was really impressive in the summer league and shot the hell out of the ball in college, so he's gonna get opportunity. But you also have Fred VanVleet, who's a veteran point guard that you're paying a lot of money to start for that team. So what the rotation looks like with their guards will be interesting, how much Reed Shepherd's able to get on the floor. Jabari Smith needs to develop his offensive game further, and Amen Thompson especially is like one of the most, I would say, boom or bust players in the NBA right now. I'm not saying that he could outright be strictly a bust. Like, it's one or the other type of situation, but the guy is freakishly athletic, has a lot of good point guard skills, which also adds to the issue with their guard situation, and I think he has a lot of upside. The jump shot's not great, and his defense isn't where his brother's is, but to be fair, where his brother's defense is fucking ridiculous, especially for someone coming off of their first season. Another couple guys for Houston is Tari Eason and Cam Whitmore. Like, we have a lot of young players who could be something, and there isn't a distinct hierarchy. Like, if you had to predict what players are going to be key players on this team 3 years from now, I think there's a variety of things you can predict that would be reasonable. Is Jalen Green actually really good as he displayed the last like 2-ish months of the season? Or is the trend of him playing well around that part of the season historically evidence that that was just another flash in the pan, and more often than not, he will ultimately be a net negative player, in spite of the fact that offensively he does have quite a bit of talent. It's more of, will he actually put that talent together? Freakish athlete and has displayed a lot of smoothness with his shot creation, but the consistency with it, not always the best. All of that said, Houston does have a lot of talent. I don't know that they can put it together towards something resembling a future contending core, but they do have enough to be pretty competitive right now. I believe they was it that they missed the play-in? Like, they were the 11th seed last year? Yeah, in the Western Conference, they were the 11th seed. So they were 5 games behind the Warriors for getting into the play-in spot, but they were the best of the bad teams in the West. They had 10 more wins than the Utah Jazz, who were ranked at 12th. So Houston will probably be one of the better bad teams in the NBA. What will be interesting to look out for them is this, like, what is the future of this team actually going to look like? I think we got some information in that realm in the previous season, but I think we're going to feel more defined for what the future holds for this franchise going into next year. For what it's worth, I actually really like Jabari Smith Jr. I think he's underrated. I think he's easily the most underrated player on this team. But with that said, we're going to be moving on to the next team, which is going to be the Utah Jazz, a 31-win record last year for Utah. They were actually competing for a playoff spot for a large percentage of the season, and they did not actually clinch it. As the year went along, they played worse and worse and worse. I think they made a couple of trades as the season went along as well, if I'm recalling correctly. But as a whole, this team is somewhat competitive because they have an all-star player, and I think one who's routinely pretty underrated, Lauri Markkanen, on this team, a really good play finisher who would really benefit from playing on a team that has a more capable shot creator, specifically a playmaker to set him up and who will draw attention away from him. As of right now, he pretty much has all of the defense's attention. Walker Kessler is an interesting young player. He kind of took a step back in his second season. The limitations of his offensive game kind of came more to the forefront than the initial impressiveness of his defense. There's Keontae George, who's interesting, that I think is going to get a lot more opportunity this year. Showed better playmaking, but worse scoring efficiency than I anticipated last year. Who else? Is there any important players that I'm missing? I'm sure they drafted somebody that I'm blanking on right now, but I don't expect them to be great. And hopefully they will trade Lauri Markkanen by the deadline. That's kind of been pretty much since he's been there, and since he started. We can't because of his contract. You're right. Can't trade him till the offseason. So yeah, that's just more evidence that they're probably going to end up being bad, but not terrible. Not a lot to go on with them right now. Another one where it's like, I don't really know what you're going to look like in 3 years. Number 25, the middle of the worst, I'm picking the Detroit Pistons. Now, you're probably going to see the Detroit Pistons at the bottom of a lot of people's power rankings, but I actually think there's good reason to feel positively about this team. The number one issue that this team had last year was they couldn't shoot, and they really didn't have anybody that could put the ball in the basket, period, besides for Cade Cunningham, and then like Marcus Sasser and Jaden Ivey, who really didn't do it super well within the flow of the offense. But they've added Tobias Harris, who, while he's not a very good player, he's someone who can get you 16, 17 points on relatively good efficiency. He's someone who can do a little bit of shot creation, not just entirely relying on being set up. Cade Cunningham is going to be operating with the most amount of space that he has operated with in his NBA career to this point. They traded for Fontecchio from the Utah Jazz last season. That's actually a reminder of what one of those deals was that I was trying to remember. But Fontecchio proved to be a very, very good three-point shooting threat for them, and they have signed Malik Beasley. They traded for Tim Hardaway Jr. I think there are enough guys on this team that can competently shoot the three ball now that the spacing will improve, and that will mean a huge efficiency jump for Cade Cunningham. I think just unlocking Cade, I believe that Cade is a good player who's just had rather unfortunate circumstances the past couple of years. Give that guy more space. I think the offense will improve rather dramatically. I also wouldn't be surprised if we saw the Pistons make a deal or two to actually try and be more competitive this season. I think last year was a breaking point for a lot of Pistons fans because they're one of those teams that's just like perpetually rebuilding. Like there was maybe a year or two in there with Reggie and Andre Drummond where they were able to make the playoffs, and then the one actually pretty fun year with Blake Griffin, even if they weren't an actually great team. But otherwise, this is a team that has missed the playoffs year after year after year, pretty much ever since the end of the 2004 era Pistons. I think this is probably, unfortunate as this may be, one of the best rosters that they have trotted out in quite a while. You get some more development from Jalen Duren, Jaden Ivey as well, and I think this team could be competitive. Still bad, still not going to win more than like 30 games, but I don't think they will be as historically bad as they were last year. Next up, we have the Toronto Raptors, and they're actually a team that I could see going in a variety of directions. If they ended up being actually one of the more competitive ones here, I wouldn't be all that surprised, but that doesn't really seem to be the motive of this team at the moment. But they do actually have good NBA talent on the roster. I believe Jakob Poeltl is still there at the center position. Obviously, he's not at the forefront of that conversation, but he's the first guy that came to my mind. But RJ Barrett, really, really good for them last year in the 30 or so games that he played with them. You can say the same thing for Emmanuel Quickley. And Scotty Barnes had a really, really encouraging season last year because his shooting, which has been the biggest hindrance and the biggest concern of his game to this point in his career, took a rather dramatic upturn. Now, the percentage got worse as the season went along, and that factor, as well as RJ Barrett being the inconsistent three-point shooter that he has been throughout most of his career, does leave me a little bit concerned about the fit of that pair of forwards because of one of, and especially if both of those guys don't shoot the three ball well, that offense is probably going to be pretty disastrous because you have a couple of guys who are like more slasher types, but in the case of RJ, not the strongest playmaker in the world, and then operating with pretty piss poor space. They're going to have a traditional five out there. I don't even know what their starting shooting guard situation is because last year it was Gary Trent. Emmanuel Quickley is someone that I'm rather high on. I liked what he did for them last year, 18.7 assists, 7 3-point attempts a game on 40% shooting. He was one of the best defensive guards in the NBA with the New York Knicks off of the bench. Grady Dick will probably be their starter if I had to guess. I would be surprised if it was anybody else. So yeah, Grady Dick last year shot well from three, was awful at the very start where he literally couldn't do anything, but he really improved as the season went along. So they're not going to have a horrible starting lineup, but after their guards, the three-point shooting, after their starting guards, the three-point shooting gets rather concerning to me, and I'm unsure what that will actually look like. They won 25 games last year, and that was with them having Pascal to propel them to a couple of them to start the year. They're not very good with this core. I do think you can shape something good for this core going forward, but I just don't know if it's currently here. So Toronto is a team that hasn't bottomed out in the past. That's not historically been their MO, but I do think there's little reason to do anything other than that. And the fact that they shipped off OG and Pascal in this previous offseason, to me, shows a change in mentality, at least to some degree. Moving on past the Raptors, we're going back to a Western Conference team with the Portland Trailblazers. Portland is a team that does have a decent amount of talent, but they're also not well structured at the moment. They're not as good as the sum of their parts, as I like to say. I think that Scoot Henderson will just definitely be better than he was last year. Probably not as good as he was in game 1 of my fucking Warriors My League, because he had 21 first quarter points. But in general, I doubt he will be as bad as he was to start the year. He also closed the year better than he did opening it. He actually started to shoot competently from the three-point line, got to the basket a little bit better. There's not going to be Malcolm Brogdon there anymore. What team is Malcolm Brogdon even on? Wizards? Ugh, what a poor guy. Has to be on the Blazers and the Wizards in back-to-back seasons after being on the Celtics. That sucks ass. Yeah, so he's not going to be there. He was a veteran presence that was nice. They got Donovan Clingan. The center position is going to be interesting between him and DeAndre Ayton. I would guess that Ayton's probably the better player right now, but they want to give Clingan the opportunity to develop into a better player than him. And there's a chance that because he's a less is more type of player, not someone who you're going to feed the ball, that will work better in their favor. You also have Jeremy Grant, who is a decent scorer, and you also have Shaedon Sharpe, who I am rather high on. I don't know how effectively he will actually be a contributing winning player right now, but I do think that he will be eventually. He also has a lot of defensive upside that he hasn't really cashed in on because of his ridiculous vertical leap. There's also Duop Reath last year, who was an interesting rookie for them, who really stretches the floor super well. Rookie, but also 27, 28 years old. With the Trailblazers, there's a couple of good players here, but I neglected to mention Anthony Simons, also a pretty good player. Big defensive liability, but in terms of off the dribble shot creation, he's actually up there with some of the best, specifically as a pull-up three-point shooter. I don't anticipate them being garbage, but I do anticipate them being bad. I would expect a leap from them next year because I do have faith that Scoot Henderson will still turn into an all-star caliber guy, but I would say it is on this season to determine if that actually happens. If he ends up being pretty disappointing this year again, might start to feel differently about his upside. Also, for what it's worth, Jeremy Grant, decent chance he'll get moved. We obviously said the same thing going into last year, and that did not end up happening. I don't know. It's going to happen eventually, whether it's this year or not. And he's not really someone who really helps a losing team all that much. Next, at 28, I have the Chicago Bulls. There is a part of me that is fearful that the Bulls will just bullshit their way to like 33 wins, because this is something that they have managed to do when they were trying to bottom out time and time again. What I recall specifically is the 2017-18 season, they just shipped off Jimmy Butler to Minnesota, and they have rookie Lauri Markkanen, and in the draft is one Luka Doncic. There's also DeAndre Ayton, Marvin Bagley, Trae Young, other very high-level prospects, and the Chicago Bulls go on like I think it's the month of February or March, but for a full month they were 500, like maybe even a few games over, and it was because for like a random stretch, Nikola Mirotic was like a 20-point-per-game scorer, and then because of that, they got a lower lottery pick and got Wendell Carter Jr. instead of Luka Doncic. I wouldn't be shocked if they managed to do that again. They have a couple of young players on this team that are pretty good, not as much of a veteran presence, so that might be the difference, because Nico was more of a veteran at that point in his career and was just seizing the opportunity of having more shots available to him because he was on a bad team. But there isn't a lot of shot creation on this team after Kobe White. There's a pretty steep decline, and honestly that decline falls all the way to Ayo Dosunmu. I honestly think Ayo's probably better at that than Nikola Vucevic is at this point. I think there's a decent chance Nikola Vucevic will be on the move. Also, Zach LaVine's on this roster, but I don't fucking know what's going to happen with Zach LaVine, and if he does play, I don't think he's going to contribute to winning, although he is a quality of player where if you have a truly garbage team, he will make you better than the alternative of being even more garbage. One way or the other, though, I don't expect the Bulls to be very competitive, and I think them potentially winning 32 to 35 games, that's probably more me being paranoid than the reality of the team. There's also Patrick Williams, who I'm interested to see this year what will come of him having more opportunity. Finally, he's in an offense where There isn't some hierarchy that's like well above him in terms of guys who should be getting shots. After Kobe, you can pretty much give the shots to whoever you want. Matas Buzelis, another guy who's going to be getting a lot of opportunity. A lot of unproven players, a lot of young players, and not much of a veteran presence. So the Bulls will probably be pretty fucking terrible. Next, we have the Brooklyn Nets, another team that, this is what I was saying towards the intro, like, bad teams are not as bad as they used to be. I remember, like, in the 2010s, you would get a bad NBA team that had, like, 3 NBA players, maybe 3.5. Like, a dude that you could feasibly see staying in the league, and then, like, a veteran who has been in the league historically for a while, and then like a young guy who has upside, but that's about it. And that's really the only thing you have to bank on. And otherwise you are just employing a bunch of guys who otherwise would not be a part of the National Basketball Association. Now I can point to a couple of good players on pretty much every NBA team. That's just the nature of the talent pool increasing, but our last 2 worst teams in the NBA are going to be the Brooklyn Nets and the Washington Wizards. Brooklyn has Nicholas Claxton, who is pretty solid, Cam Johnson, who I think is an excellent role player. Some of these guys I'm imagining will actually get traded. Bojan Bogdanovic, who's returning to Brooklyn after starting his career there as an older rookie. He is going to be some sort of trade asset to some extent. There's just a lot of solid players here that I'm fairly confident are going to be cashed in on. I don't know if Nicholas Claxton will be on the move. He's probably the only guy who has a real chance of sticking around, but he's not all that young either. So it's not like he's someone who they're like, well, we just need to wait for Nicholas Claxton. He's also not anything resembling like a franchise player. He's more of a complementary piece. Yeah, he is 25 years old and born in April. So yeah, he's going to be 25, 26 going into the season. I don't expect them to be good. They have practically no shot creation. Is Dennis Schroeder even still on that team, or did he go somewhere else? I think he's still on the Nets. Yeah, Dennis is still on the Brooklyn Nets, and he is pretty much, him and Cam Thomas are the extent of their shot creating ability. And unfortunately, I would say that Dennis is an okay backup, not a good starter. And I don't think that Cam Thomas is a player that particularly contributes to winning basketball. Now, will he make it rather fun to watch because the dude gets buckets? Absolutely. Will what we see resemble a competitive NBA team? I don't think so. And then last, the Washington Wizards. If there is an NBA team that has a talent deficiency right now, it is the Washington Wizards. They are exceptionally bad. Bilal Coulibaly is someone who's interesting. Deni Avdija, who was one of their few good players they traded in this offseason. Kyle Kuzma is fine. Nowhere near someone who you want to be your lead scoring option. Jonas Valanciunas provides some post scoring, but is that really what you want in your offense in 2025? I don't think that it is. Jordan Poole maybe could have a bounce back season, and if he actually had a rather significant bounce back, I could see them not being the worst team in the league. But if we get more of the complete garbage that Jordan Poole was displaying on the court last year for Washington, I see no reason why this team should be any good at all. Just a developmental year, see what Bilal Coulibaly can add to his game. I'm sure they drafted somebody who I'm blanking on again. Washington should be free wins for a lot of NBA teams, as they were last year. So just going back from the top of the list, actually let me just go in reverse so you can kind of put together the order. I will do the 1 through 30 in the final episode when we talk about the contenders in the NBA, but the worst team to me, I'm guessing, will be the Wizards. Then at 29, the Nets, 28, the Bulls, 27, the Blazers, 26, the Raptors, 25, the Pistons, 24, the Utah Jazz, 23, the Houston Rockets, 22, the Charlotte Hornets, and 21, the Atlanta Hawks. Let me know if you think I got that right, what teams you think may be worse than I anticipated, what might be better than I anticipated. Shout out to Nick for editing this video, and goodbye.